Spring break came with a tragedy 30 years ago. 21-year-old University of Texas Austin student
vanished during a spring break trip with a group of friends after crossing the border to Matamoros, Mexico.
Kilroy was abducted and murdered by a satanic drug smuggling cult in Matamoros.
The UT college student was kidnapped off the street, tortured, and sacrificed by members of a cult. His remains discovered the next month on a ranch along with other victims.
On March 14, 1989, University of Texas at Austin student Mark James Kilroy was kidnapped in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico while vacationing during spring break. He was taken by his abductors to a ranch where he was held captive for hours before being murdered in a human sacrifice ritual. Adolfo Constanzo, the leader of the cult, told his followers that human sacrifice granted them immunity from law enforcement for their drug smuggling operations. The ranch where Kilroy was murdered was in Matamoros, Santa Elena, and was owned by Brigido Hernandez. He was not a follower of Constanzo and was never charged with any of the crimes. The murder of Mark Kilroy drew worldwide media attention and initiated an international police manhunt because of the unusual circumstances of the crime. His body was found less than a month after his disappearance on April 11, 1989, and this is his story.
They still talk about Mark's death every spring break.
Mark had been kidnapped right behind him. My friend wasn't killed on the border. He was slaughtered.
Mark James Kilroy was born on March 5, 1968 in Chicago, Illinois. His parents were James William Kilroy, a chemical engineer, and Helen Josephine Kilroy, a volunteer paramedic. They moved to Texas from the Midwest after their son Mark was born. Mark excelled in both academics and athletics as a teenager and played baseball, basketball, and golf with his friends at school. He was in Boy Scouts, an honor student at Santa Fe High School, a member of the Student Council, and was ranked 14th in a class of 210 students. In 1986, he transferred to the University of Texas at Austin to become a pre-med student and prepare for his medical college admission test.
That Tuesday, Mark Kilroy and his friends would go to Brownsville and walk across the border to Matamoros. They went bar hopping. This is where Mark would last be seen alive.
On March 10, 1989, Kilroy's childhood friend Bradley Moore finished exams early and headed to Austin to pick Mark up for spring break. Both of them then headed to Santa Fe to pick up two other friends, Bill Huddleston and Brent Martin, before heading to South Padre Island, Texas. After a foggy 9-hour drive to South Texas, they arrived at South Padre Island, 20 miles from the Texas-Mexico border, shortly before midnight. They checked in at the Sheraton Hotel the next morning before heading into the beach town to explore. When they first arrived at South Padre Island, there weren't many tourists yet because it was still very early on in the 5-week spring break season. But thousands of students from the entire U.S. would begin to arrive as the weekend progressed. On March 13, 1989, one day before his abduction, Kilroy and his friends attended a bikini contest behind the Sheraton Hotel. At around 10:30 p.m., Kilroy and his friends headed to Matamoros, Mexico. They parked on the border and crossed by foot to Mexico from Texas. That night, the city of Matamoros was flooded with 15,000 spring break tourists from the U.S. on the city's main tourist street called Álvaro Obregón. The sidewalks, street, and nightclubs were packed with foreign tourists looking to enjoy cheap alcohol and enjoy Mexico's lax drinking laws. Around 2 a.m., Bill Huddleston suggested the group head back to South Padre Island. As his friends stepped out of the Hard Rock Cafe, they saw Mark Kilroy leaning against a car and talking to a woman from the Miss Tanline Bikini contest. Across Álvaro Obregón Street, thousands of tourists were leaving the bars and heading to the border town of Brownsville, Texas, but others moved in various directions. The large crowd of people made it difficult for Mark and his friends to walk across the border together without getting separated in the stampede of tourists. Mark Kilroy stopped at the steps of a house on Álvaro Obregón to say goodbye to the woman from the Miss Tanline contest. He then waited for his friend Bill Huddleston to catch up to him. Bill had run off to a nearby alley to use the bathroom while Mark waited for his return. In the 5 minutes it took for Huddleston to come back and catch up to the friend group, Mark had vanished. His friends searched for him for hours, even after the establishments had closed down and the streets had cleared at around 4:30 a.m. They then crossed the border, assuming Mark may have already crossed to Brownsville, Texas with another group and was waiting near their parked car. Without cell phones existing, there was no way to get in touch with Mark and confirm his whereabouts. They waited a few minutes in the Brownsville parking lot before returning to South Padre Island, a 45-minute drive away, without Mark. They thought that Mark probably left for the hotel with somebody else. When they woke up the next day, Mark still wasn't there. His friends then contacted the police to report him missing.
There were no witnesses. To Finley and his friends, it was like Mark vanished. 3 weeks later, the border town of Matamoros in the Rio Grande Valley would make national headlines.
The search for Mark initially began as a routine missing persons investigation. Students that were reported missing in Matamoros in the past would often turn up in the following days with a hangover and blurry memory of the previous night's events. Mark Kilroy was just one of the 60 people who had disappeared in Matamoros in the first 3 months of 1989. However, his case drew more attention in the U.S. because his uncle, Ken Kilroy, worked at the United States Customs Service office in Los Angeles, and when the news reached his uncle, a police task force was created in Brownsville to search for Mark, and both the Mexican and U.S. authorities suspected that Kilroy's disappearance involved foul play. When Mark's friends reported the disappearance, customs agents went with them to Matamoros, Mexico to help retrace their steps. However, none of the friends were able to precisely recall the exact moment or place where Mark disappeared. During the investigation, Mark's parents headed to Rio Grande Valley and circulated more than 20,000 handouts throughout the region and offered a $15,000 reward to anyone who could help locate their son. They suspected that because state and local authorities were acting so slowly on the matter and not sharing enough information, Mark's murderers probably had insiders working within the police department. But then the key break in the case came on April 1st, 1989, when Mexican authorities manning a drug checkpoint saw a vehicle run past the roadblock without stopping. The vehicle had crossed the international border from Texas and sped through a Mexican federal highway, and instead of turning on their police sirens and stopping the truck, the police decided to follow it using an unmarked vehicle. The checkpoint runner then traveled out to the Santa Elena ranch outside Matamoros. The police pulled off at a distance to observe, and after about 30 minutes, the driver of the truck took off from the ranch and headed back into the city. The officers decided to make their move on the ranch. Police determined that the driver of the truck was Serafin Hernandez Garcia, the nephew of a local drug lord whose operations were based around the ranch area. But instead of arresting Hernandez Garcia, the police decided to continue gathering more evidence on the suspected criminal activities at the ranch. They used the informants in Matamoros to inquire on family activities at Santa Elena in order to make a series of crucial arrests. The detainees were sent to a jail center while the police interrogated another caretaker at the ranch. This individual identified Mark Kilroy through a photograph and then pointed to a shack located on the property. When the police interrogated Hernandez Garcia separately, he confessed that several people, including Mark Kilroy, had been killed over the course of several months at Santa Elena Ranch. Hernandez Garcia said that the slayings had been ordered by Adolfo Constanzo, a cult leader who practiced a ritual form of human sacrifice in the belief that it provided supernatural protection for his drug gang. Constanzo believed that by sacrificing his victims, those doing the sacrifice were ensured strength, abundance, and immunity from law enforcement and injury. Hernandez Garcia said that Constanzo had ordered his men to specifically find a white American male to sacrifice the night of Mark Kilroy's abduction. According to him, he and other members of the gang had mingled with the spring break students in Matamoros on the night of March 14th. As Mark stood on the street near his friends, one of the men lured him close to his truck. As Kilroy approached the vehicle, Hernandez Garcia and another cult member grabbed Kilroy and wrestled him inside the vehicle. When one of the perpetrators stopped for a few moments to catch his breath 2 blocks along the road, Mark broke loose and ran away, but was intercepted by another vehicle driven by other gang members. He was taken as prisoner at gunpoint and was handcuffed in the back of the second car. That's when the gang members drove Kilroy through the back streets of the city and to Santa Elena Ranch. The men left Kilroy inside the car overnight. About 12 hours after Mark was kidnapped, Constanzo and his men came to see him. They wrapped his face and mouth with duct tape and walked him through a field to a storage cabin with his hands still tied around his back. Throughout the entire night of the 15th, Constanzo tortured and sexually assaulted Kilroy. He was then led out to the field where Constanzo killed him with a machete, and after killing their victims, a common practice by this cult was to take the human brain and boil it in a designated metal pot used in ritualistic practices. The rest of Kilroy's body was dismembered, with a wire placed in a spinal column to make the retrieval of his bones from the soil an easy process. Hernandez Garcia agreed to take the police to the spot where Kilroy was buried, which was marked by the ends of the wire coming out of the dirt.
And eventually he led them. He says, I know where the guy you're looking for, the spring breaker, Mark Kilroy, I know where he is.
Hernandez Garcia agreed to take the police to the spot where Kilroy was buried, which was marked by the ends of the wire coming out of the dirt. Hernandez Garcia explained the function of the wire, saying that once they retrieved the bones, cult members would wear the fragments as necklaces to ward off danger and injury.
On April 11th, Kilroy's body was discovered on the Santa Elena Ranch. The professor of anthropology studied cults before, but wasn't prepared for what he was about to see.
On April 11, 1989, the police took Hernandez Garcia and the 4 other suspects to Santa Elena Ranch and forced them at gunpoint to spend several hours digging up the graves. When the excavation was concluded, the suspects had unearthed between 13 and 15 mutilated bodies, including Mark Kilroy's, all males who had all been killed over a period of 9 months. Mark Kilroy's corpse was officially identified after the Brownsville Police Department matched his dental records with the teeth found at the scene. Investigators concluded that most of the victims were rival drug dealers of Constanzo and not random abductees like Mark Kilroy.
There was clearly a cast iron cauldron, and I'm looking over there before I even get out, and I already know what that is.
Kilroy's and more than 14 other bodies would be found on the property.
2 weeks after the bodies were exhumed from Santa Elena, the Mexican federal police returned to the ranch early in the morning to burn down the shack and lay a wooden cross above the ashes.
The shack and land where these grisly murders happened would be cleansed and burnt to the ground.
They said that they knew the shack meant a lot to Constanzo, and burning it publicly would make him go insane. And this plan worked perfectly because reportedly the next morning, Constanzo went into a rage after the arson was reported on national television. By murdering Mark Kilroy, Constanzo attracted international media attention to himself and forced the Mexican government to focus their efforts on bringing him and everyone involved to justice. After the bodies were discovered on April 11, 1989, Constanzo fled to Mexico City, where he was eventually tracked down. The Mexico City Police Department sent 16 officers to search the area. That's where they spotted a man at the supermarket who was suspiciously attempting to buy a large amount of groceries with US dollars. Police followed the man and concluded that he was an accomplice buying groceries for Constanzo. On May 6, 1989, the police surrounded the apartment building Constanzo resided in and waited for traffic to die down before raiding the premises. While waiting, a black vehicle pulled up in front of the apartment complex and the police walked over to investigate. That's when Constanzo noticed the police from the window of his apartment and opened fire at the officers who were at ground level. Constanzo eventually ran out of ammunition and began to lose his patience. After about 45 minutes, Constanzo ordered one of his accomplices to kill him, along with another cult member. When the police climbed up the stairs and made it to Constanzo's smoke-filled apartment, his accomplice ran from the door screaming that Constanzo was dead. The accomplice also stated that although he participated in Mark Kilroy's murder, he agreed that Constanzo ordered most of the killings himself. And in an interview with the press, Kilroy's parents stated that they were relieved to hear that their son's murderer was finally brought to justice after the nightmare ordeal.